Elias Thorne lived by the creed that discipline was the fortress of the soul. In the thin, biting air of the Colorado Rockies, his small cabin was less a home and more a barracks of one. Every morning, the sun had to clear the jagged peak of Widow's Cry before his boots hit the cold wood floor at precisely 0500 hours. His bed was made with hospital corners, the single coffee mug was washed and returned to its hook, and the wood for the stove was stacked with geometric precision. This was not order for the sake of tidiness. It was armor. Each completed task was another plate of steel locked into place against the chaos of memory, a bulwark against the internal winter that had frozen him solid 2 years ago. He was 43, but the grief he carried was ancient. It had carved new lines around his eyes, deeper than the sun and wind ever could, and had salted his dark, military short hair with a premature gray at the temples. He had been a Navy SEAL, a man forged in the world's most unforgiving crucibles, trained to move toward the sound of chaos, not away from it. But the chaos that had claimed his wife, Sarah, hadn't come from a combat zone. It had come on a slick, black ice patch of highway, a silent, indifferent slide into oblivion. And then there was Max, his military working dog, lost not to a car but to a sniper's bullet, in a dusty, forgotten corner of the world, a year before that. The two losses had become intertwined, a double helix of pain that had rewritten his DNA. He was no longer a protector. He was a monument to what he had failed to protect. His sister, Chloe, was the only line he kept open to the world he had abandoned. Her calls were a weekly intrusion he tolerated out of a vestigial sense of duty. "You need supplies, Eli." Her voice had crackled over the satellite phone the day before. "The news is calling for a monster storm. Don't be a stubborn hermit." He had grunted an affirmative, the sound more a concession to end the conversation than an agreement. But she was right. His discipline demanded preparedness. An empty pantry was a tactical failure. So he had pulled on his worn parka, the fabric still holding the faint, ghostly scent of Sarah's perfume from a time she'd borrowed it, and steered his old truck down the winding mountain pass toward the small town of Aspen Ridge. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, heavy and pregnant with snow. The wind was already beginning to keen through the pines, a mournful song that echoed the hollowness in his chest. The town was a small collection of stone and timber buildings, huddled together for warmth against the looming mountains. He parked in front of the general store, its windows glowing with a warm yellow light that felt like an accusation against the grayness of his world. Inside, Agnes Miller, the store's proprietor, gave him a knowing look from behind the counter. She was a woman made of hickory and kindness, a matriarch to the entire town who had buried her own husband and a son lost in the service. She saw the same ghost in Elias's eyes that she saw in her own mirror. "Heard it's going to be a bad one, Elias," she said, her voice raspy and warm like a wool blanket. "Stocking up?" He just nodded, grabbing a basket and moving through the aisles with methodical efficiency. Canned goods, coffee, flour, batteries. A checklist. He avoided the aisle with the dog food, a familiar pang of phantom pain tightening in his gut at the memory of Max's eager anticipation at mealtime. He paid in cash, avoiding conversation, and was halfway to the door when Agnes called out, "You take care up there. No man is an island, not in a storm like this." He didn't look back, but her words followed him out into the swirling snow, clinging to him like burrs. The drive back up the mountain was a descent into a world of white. The snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets, the wind rocking the truck on its chassis. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his focus absolute. This was a familiar state, man against the elements, a clear objective, a mission. It was simple, it was clean. It was as he rounded a sharp, treacherous bend, the one the locals called Devil's Elbow, that the mission changed. His headlights cut through the maelstrom and landed on a shape huddled against the snowbank on the far side of the road, a dark, unmoving lump that was rapidly being buried by the blizzard. His training screamed obstacle, his instincts screamed danger, but a deeper, long dormant part of him saw something else. Vulnerability. He slowed the truck to a crawl, peering through the frantic slap of the windshield wipers. It wasn't a fallen branch or a rock, it was an animal, a dog. He pulled over, the truck's tires crunching in the deep snow. He left the engine running, the headlights carving a tunnel of light into the storm. For a moment, he remained in the cab, the warmth a tempting prison. Go home. It's not your problem. The mission is to get back to the cabin. But Agnes's words echoed in his mind. No man is an island. He let out a harsh breath, a plume of white in the cold air, and opened the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. The wind tore at him, trying to push him back into the truck. He leaned into it, his boots sinking deep into the snow with each step. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a German shepherd, her coat matted with ice and snow, her body curled tightly against the wind. Her head was up, but just barely, and her eyes, when they found his, were not filled with aggression or fear, but with a profound, soul-deep weariness. It was the look of a soldier who had fought to the last and knew the battle was lost. And then he saw why she wasn't moving. Tucked beneath her, sheltered by the last of her body heat, were 3 tiny puppies, whimpering faintly, their sounds almost swallowed by the storm. Something inside Elias, a tectonic plate of grief and resolve that had been motionless for 2 years, shifted with a painful, grinding crack. He saw Max in the noble slope of her muzzle. He saw Sarah in the fierce, protective curve of her body. He saw a duty he could not ignore. The mother dog watched him approach, a low growl rumbling in her chest, more a reflex than a genuine threat. She was too weak to fight, but she would die trying. He stopped a few feet away, dropping to one knee in the snow, ignoring the cold that seeped instantly through his jeans. He held out a gloved hand, palm open. "Easy, girl," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." He kept his movements slow, deliberate, projecting calm as he had been trained to do. The dog's growl subsided into a whine. Her eyes, pools of dark amber in the stark headlights, held his, and in them he saw a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, a fragile spark of trust. She was surrendering not to him, but to the hope he represented. He knew he had to act fast. They were fading. The cold was a patient predator, and it was closing in for the kill. His mind switched from civilian to operator. Assess, plan, execute. The mother was too weak to walk. The puppies were minutes from freezing. The truck was 50 feet away, an arc in a sea of white. He shrugged off his heavy parka, the icy wind immediately sinking its teeth into his thermal shirt. He laid the coat on the snow, creating an insulated nest. Carefully, one by one, he reached under the mother and gathered the shivering puppies. They were so small, their eyes barely open, their little bodies feeling like bags of ice. He placed them in the center of the parka. One of them, a little male with a bold white patch on his chest, tried to feebly bat at his glove. A foolish hero, even at death's door. The mother watched his every move, her head low. She didn't have the strength to protest, only to trust, now for her. She was heavier than she looked, all bone and matted fur. He slid his arms beneath her, his muscles straining. As he lifted her, she let out a soft groan of pain and exhaustion, her head lolling against his shoulder. He carried her to the truck first, laying her gently on the passenger side floor, where the heat was blasting. Then he went back for the parka and the puppies. He bundled them up, pulling the zipper closed to create a makeshift carrier. As he lifted the bundle, a flash of color caught his eye, tangled in the lining. It was Sarah's old silk scarf, a soft whisper of lavender and gray, which she had tucked into the pocket last winter for reasons he could no longer remember. He had forgotten it was there. Now, its impossible softness brushed against the cheek of the smallest, weakest puppy. A ghost of the past, helping to save the future. He settled the precious cargo on the passenger seat, the mother dog lifting her head just enough to see that her pups were safe before collapsing again. The drive back to the cabin was a masterclass in controlled urgency. He navigated the treacherous road with an intensity he hadn't felt since his last mission, the lives in his truck weighing more heavily than any gear he had ever carried. When he finally pulled up to the cabin, the storm was a full-blown blizzard, visibility reduced to near zero. His sanctuary, his fortress of solitude, was about to be breached. Getting them inside was another carefully executed operation. He carried the mother first, her weight a heavy grounding presence in his arms. He laid her on the thick bearskin rug in front of the stone hearth, the only soft thing he owned. He went back for the puppies, carrying the parka like a bomb he needed to disarm. He settled them into a cardboard box he lined with old, clean towels, placing it close enough to the fire for warmth, but far enough for safety. The sterile, quiet order of his home was shattered. There was the smell of wet dog, the sound of tiny whimpers, the sight of a half-dead animal bleeding melted snow onto his floor. The fortress had fallen, and as he stoked the fire, its flames dancing in the dark, weary eyes of the mother dog, Elias Thorne felt the first painful crack in his own internal ice. The hours that followed were a blur of awkward, determined caregiving. Elias, a man trained to dismantle explosives and neutralize threats, found himself utterly out of his depth with 3-pound creatures who couldn't regulate their own body temperature. He remembered snippets from Max's puppyhood, fragments of knowledge he thought he had buried. He warmed towels in front of the fire and wrapped each puppy, rubbing them gently to stimulate circulation. The mother, whom he had started thinking of as Sheba for her regal, though depleted bearing, watched him with an unnerving intelligence. She was too weak to do anything but lick them when he placed them near her, her rough tongue a slow, loving metronome of maternal care. He knew they needed more than warmth. They needed nourishment. He had no formula, nothing suitable for them. He did the only thing he could think of. He called Agnes. The satellite phone was staticky, the storm interfering, but he got through. He explained the situation in clipped, practical sentences, stripping it of all emotion. Found a dog, German Shepherd, 3 pups, bad shape, need supplies. There was a pause on the other end, and then Agnes's voice, clear and steady. You stay put, Elias. My son-in-law has the plow on his truck. We'll get to you, don't you worry. Waiting was an exercise in an unfamiliar kind of tension. It wasn't the sharp, adrenalized waiting of a mission, but a slow, simmering anxiety. He sat on the floor by the hearth, watching the puppies. Their personalities were already beginning to emerge. The one with the white patch on his chest, the foolish hero, was the most active, crawling over his siblings in a clumsy quest for warmth. Elias found himself calling him Buddy. Another, a dark-furred male, was preternaturally still, watching everything with wide, fearful eyes. He was a little shadow, and the name stuck. The third, a female, was the smallest and weakest. She barely moved. He focused all his energy on her, rubbing her tiny body, whispering words of encouragement he didn't know he possessed. 2 hours later, the rumble of a heavy engine cut through the howl of the wind. A set of powerful headlights illuminated the swirling snow outside his window. Agnes had kept her word. She came in, bundled in a heavy coat and carrying a box filled with supplies. Her son-in-law, a burly man named Frank, right behind her with a bag of high-quality dog food. Agnes took one look at the scene, the formidable Elias Thorne on the floor, tending to a tiny puppy, and a soft, knowing smile touched her lips. She didn't comment on it. Instead, she got to work, her movements practical and reassuring. Puppy formula, bottles, blankets, she said, unpacking her box of miracles. And I brought a thermos of my beef stew for the mama. She needs her strength. She showed Elias how to mix the formula and hold the bottle, her gnarled, gentle hands, guiding his large, scarred ones. He fed Shadow first, the quiet, watchful one. The pup struggled at first, then latched on, his tiny body racked with suckling tremors. The feeling of that fragile life pulling sustenance from his hand was a strange, powerful current that seemed to travel up his arm and directly into his chest, finding the frozen lockbox where he kept his heart. While he fed the puppies, Agnes tended to Sheba, coaxing her to eat the warm, rich stew. The dog ate slowly, gratefully, her tail giving a single weak thump against the rug. She's a good mother, Agnes said quietly, watching the scene. Been through a lot. You can see it in her eyes. Elias just grunted, his focus on the tiny female pup who was now drinking from the bottle. What happened to you, Elias? Agnes continued, her tone gentle, not prying. It was a storm, too. One that hits on the inside. Sometimes you just have to let something in to show you the way out. He didn't answer, but her words landed, not as an attack on his fortress, but as a key sliding into a long rusted lock. Over the next few days, as the blizzard raged outside, the cabin transformed. The rigid, silent order gave way to a soft, living chaos. There were puppy blankets by the fire, the faint smell of milk formula in the air, and the constant, shuffling presence of 4 new heartbeats. Sheba regained her strength with astonishing speed. She was a devoted mother, cleaning her pups, nudging them toward her for warmth, and watching Elias with a cautious but growing trust. Buddy lived up to his name, embarking on heroic, clumsy explorations of the cabin, his oversized paws tripping him up at every turn. He'd attack Elias's bootlaces with a ferocious growl no louder than a bumblebee, and once Elias felt the corner of his own mouth twitch upward in a ghost of a smile. Shadow remained his primary concern. The little dog was healthy, but he carried a fear that seemed too big for his small body. He would flinch at loud noises and hide behind his mother when Elias approached. Elias saw a reflection in him, a soul walled off by trauma. He made it his personal mission to win Shadow's trust. He would sit on the floor for hours, not looking at the pup, just being present. Until finally one afternoon, Shadow crept forward and with trembling hesitation, laid his tiny head on Elias's knee. The warmth and weight of that small, trusting gesture was overwhelming. It was a surrender. It was an acceptance. It was a beginning. The storm broke on the 5th day, leaving the world outside pristine and silent, draped in a thick blanket of white. The peace was shattered by the sound of an approaching snowmobile. Elias looked out the window to see a man in the uniform of the county animal control officer dismounting near his porch. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, snaked its way into his gut. He knew with the certainty of a soldier sensing an ambush that this was a new threat. He opened the door before the man could knock. The officer was young, with a face that was trying to be stern, but hadn't quite settled into it yet. His name tag read Miller. He was Agnes's nephew, a fact that offered little comfort. "Mr. Thorne," he began, his tone officially polite. "Agnes told me what you did, a good deed. But we got a call about a stray GSD and pups in this area before the storm hit. I have to follow protocol. They need to be brought to the shelter." Elias's entire body went rigid. The armor he had allowed to loosen snapped back into place, harder and colder than before. "They're not strays," he said, his voice flat and low. "They're with me." "I understand, sir," Miller said, clearly uncomfortable. "But the law is the law. They have to undergo a 10-day hold for observation and to see if an owner comes forward. It's procedure. After that, if they're unclaimed, you can file for adoption." 10 days. The words were a death sentence. To rip them from this safe, warm place and put them in a concrete kennel. To separate Sheba from her pups. The very idea was a violation. He thought of Shadow, of the fragile trust he had just begun to build. A shelter would shatter him. "No," Elias said. The word was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Miller sighed, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "Sir, I don't want to be difficult. My aunt speaks very highly of you. But I have a job to do. I can give you 24 hours to prepare them. I'll be back tomorrow at noon. If they're not ready to go, I'll have to get a warrant." He looked genuinely apologetic, but the threat was clear. He was the law, and the law was about to break this fragile new world apart. Miller left, the buzz of his snowmobile fading into the vast, snowy silence. Elias stood in the doorway, the cold air washing over him, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was a cold, rising fury he hadn't experienced since he'd received the news about Sarah. This was not a storm of wind and snow he could fight. This was a storm of rules and regulations, an enemy with no face. He closed the door and turned to look at his small, chaotic, perfect family. Sheba was on her feet, sensing his distress, her head cocked, a low whine in her throat. Buddy was trying to untie his boot again, and Shadow was peeking out from behind the wood box, his dark eyes wide with a fear that mirrored Elias's own. For the first time, he spoke the word that had been forming in his heart. "This is your home," he whispered to them. "This is our family." And he knew, with chilling certainty, that he would not let anyone take them away. The next 24 hours were a long, slow torment. Elias felt like a commander on the eve of a battle he knew he couldn't win. He considered his options, all of them bleak. He could run, pack the dogs into his truck, and disappear further into the mountains. But that would make him a fugitive. He could plead with Miller, but the young officer was bound by rules. He could call his sister, Chloe, a lawyer, but the legal process would be too slow. Every path led to the same place, a cage. The thought was intolerable. He spent the morning reinforcing the bond he had forged, sitting with the dogs, speaking to them in a low, calm voice, trying to project a confidence he did not feel. Sheba was agitated. Animals have an instinct for impending disruption, a sixth sense for the tremors that precede an earthquake. She paced the cabin, her nails clicking on the wood floor. She kept nudging her puppies, herding them into a corner as if to hide them. Her anxiety was a mirror to his own. He watched her, a knot tightening in his stomach. He saw the wildness in her, the deep, instinctual drive to protect her young at any cost. It was a language he understood perfectly. Just before noon, as the sun reached its apex in the cold blue sky, Elias heard the distant whine of the snowmobile. Miller was punctual, a wave of suffocating pressure built in his chest. He looked at Sheba. Her ears were pricked, her body coiled like a spring. The sound grew louder, a mechanical intrusion into their quiet world. And then, the instinct he had been watching in her took over. With a panicked bark, she bolted, not for the corner, but for the door. In his distress, Elias hadn't latched it properly. She shouldered it open and shot out into the blinding white snow, a streak of black and tan against the canvas of winter. "Sheba!" Elias yelled, his voice raw with disbelief. The puppies, startled by the noise and their mother's flight, scrambled after her. Buddy tumbled head over heels down the porch steps, righting himself with a yelp and continuing his foolishly brave pursuit. Shadow, terrified but loyal, followed his brother, a small, dark shape swallowed by the immense landscape. In seconds they were gone, vanished into the thick pine forest that bordered his property. The snowmobile engine cut off. Officer Miller was walking up the path, a transport kennel in his hand, a grim look on his face. He saw the open door, saw the frantic look in Elias's eyes, and understood immediately. "No," Miller breathed. "Where did they go?" Elias didn't answer. He was already moving. He grabbed his parka, shoved his feet into his heavy-duty boots, and snatched a coil of rope from a hook by the door. His mind was a maelstrom, but his body was calm, falling back on the muscle memory of 1,000 urgent deployments. Mission parameters: locate and secure friendly assets in a hostile environment. "Thorn, wait," Miller called after him. "The temperature is dropping. There are ravines, drifts. It's not safe." But Elias was already at the tree line, his eyes scanning the snow for tracks. He found them easily, the mother's larger prints and the frantic, shallow divots of the puppies. They were heading uphill, deeper into the wilderness. "They're my family," Elias yelled back over his shoulder, the words torn from him by the wind and a desperate, ragged hope. "I'm not losing anyone else." He plunged into the forest, the silence of the snow-laden trees a stark contrast to the storm in his soul. He moved with a speed and efficiency that belied his years, his SEAL training kicking in. He tracked them relentlessly, his gaze missing nothing: a broken twig, a deeper scuff in the snow, the direction of the wind. He could feel the cold beginning to bite, a familiar enemy. An old shrapnel wound in his thigh, a souvenir from Kandahar, began to ache with a deep, throbbing rhythm that matched his frantic heartbeat. He ignored it. Pain was just data. He found Buddy first. The foolish hero had gotten himself into a predictable mess. He had slid into a shallow depression, a small hollow hidden by a snow-covered fir bough, and couldn't climb back out. He was whining pitifully, his bravado gone. Elias scooped him up, tucking the shivering pup inside his parka. "All right, hero," he murmured, zipping the coat up to his chin. "Let's go find your brother and your mom." The small, warm weight against his chest was a comfort and a burden, a reminder of what was still at stake. He followed the remaining tracks for another half hour, climbing higher. The air grew thinner, colder. He found Shadow's tracks veering off from his mother's. The pup had been trying to keep up but had fallen behind. Elias followed the small prints to the edge of a steep, snow-covered ravine. He looked down, and his blood ran cold. 20 feet below, huddled on a narrow ledge, was Shadow. He had slipped and tumbled, coming to rest on a precarious perch. Above him, the snow on the lip of the ravine was fractured, threatening to give way at any moment. Below him was a sheer 50-foot drop onto jagged rocks. And on the other side of the ravine, Sheba stood, whining in distress. She had realized her pup was missing and had circled back, but she couldn't get to him. She was trapped, watching her child in mortal danger. She looked at Elias, her eyes pleading. It was a choice. Go for the mother, the easier target, or risk everything for the one in the most immediate peril. There was no choice. He would save the one who needed him most, just as he always had. Officer Miller appeared at his side, breathing heavily, his face pale. He had followed Elias. He took in the scene, the man, the dog, the terrified puppy on the ledge, and his official demeanor cracked. My God, he whispered. Elias was already uncoiling his rope, his hands working with practiced speed, tying a bowline around the trunk of a thick, sturdy pine. He handed the other end to Miller. Keep it taut, he ordered, his voice the calm, authoritative tone of a team leader. Don't let me fall, but give me slack when I need it. Miller, shaken but resolved, nodded, wrapping the rope around his hands. Thorn, this is insane. Elias was already securing Buddy inside his parka, ensuring the pup was safe. It's necessary, he said, and without another word, he began to lower himself over the edge of the ravine. The snow and ice crumbled under his boots. He moved slowly, testing each foothold, his life literally in Miller's hands. The cold rock bit at his fingers. His wounded thigh screamed in protest. He blocked it all out. His focus was on the small, shivering ball of fur on the ledge below. Shadow was watching him, trembling violently, too scared to even make a sound. It's okay, boy, Elias said, his voice a low, steady murmur. I've got you. I'm not going to leave you. He finally reached the ledge, his boots finding a precarious purchase. He crouched down, moving slowly so as not to startle the terrified pup. He reached out a hand. Shadow flinched back, pressing himself against the rock wall. Elias didn't pull back his hand. He just held it there, steady and patient. I know you're scared, he said softly. I get scared too, but we're a team now, you and me. We get each other out of this. He waited. The seconds stretched into an eternity, the wind whistling around them. And then Shadow leaned forward and licked his fingers. It was the signal. Elias gently scooped him up, his heart aching at how small and fragile the pup felt. He tucked Shadow into his parka with Buddy, zipping it as high as it would go. Okay, Miller, he yelled. Pull me up, slow and steady. The climb up was a grueling agony. His thigh was on fire, his arms burned with fatigue, and the weight of the two puppies felt like 100 pounds. But the rope held. Miller, his face a mask of concentration, pulled with all his strength. Elias scrambled over the lip of the ravine and collapsed in the snow, gasping for air, the precious cargo in his coat whining softly. Sheba was there instantly, licking his face, nudging the lump in his jacket, her relief a palpable force. Miller stared at him, his official mask completely gone, replaced by a look of profound respect. He looked from the exhausted man to the reunited dogs. He looked at the rope burns on his own hands. He had seen protocol, but now he had witnessed sacrifice. The law is the law, Miller said, his voice quiet and hoarse. But sometimes there's a higher law. He reached down and offered a hand to Elias. Let's go home, Mr. Thorne. They made their way back to the cabin, a strange and unified procession. Elias limping heavily, supported by Miller, with Sheba trotting faithfully at their side. When they got back, Elias unzipped his parka, and the two puppies tumbled out onto the rug, immediately swarmed by their anxious mother. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude, was now a sanctuary of reunion, filled with the sounds of happy whines and the warmth of a fire that Elias had never felt so keenly. Miller didn't take out his kennel. Instead, he took out a pen and a clipboard. Let's get the paperwork started, he said, a small smile on his face. We'll file them as a special case. Owner surrendered to a qualified foster pending permanent adoption. We can backdate it. No one needs to know they ever left this cabin. He was bending the rules, breaking them even, but he was doing it for the right reason. He was choosing mercy over protocol. In the weeks that followed, the last of the winter snows melted, and something inside Elias melted with them. The transformation of his cabin was complete. It was no longer a sterile barracks, but a home, filled with the chaotic energy of life. There were chew toys on the floor, a water bowl by the door, and dog beds flanking the hearth. Dr. Eris Thorne, the town veterinarian and no relation, became a regular visitor, initially to check on the health of Sheba and the pups, but soon her visits became more social. She brought medical expertise and a gentle, calming presence that Elias found himself looking forward to. She had kind eyes that saw past his armor and a quiet strength that reminded him of Sarah, but in a way that didn't hurt. It felt hopeful. Agnes continued to be the community's anchor, dropping off food and wisdom in equal measure. She saw the light returning to Elias's eyes, the hard lines around his mouth softening. One evening, she watched him as he sat on the floor, patiently teaching Shadow to trust the feel of a brush on his coat, while Buddy heroically tried to rescue the brush from this terrible fate. "You didn't just save them, you know," she said softly from her chair by the fire. "They were sent to you, a mission of a different kind." Elias looked at the dogs, at the life teeming around him, and knew she was right. His old mission had been about neutralizing threats, about fighting an enemy. This new mission was about building, nurturing, and protecting. He had started working with Eris and Miller to set up a small non-profit, a rescue operation based out of his property. They would take in hard-to-place dogs, especially from military and police backgrounds, and use his skills to rehabilitate them, to give them a new purpose, just as he had been given one. One warm spring evening, as the sun set behind Widow's Cry, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet, Elias sat on his porch steps. The air was soft, smelling of pine and damp earth. Sheba rested her head on his good knee, her amber eyes soft and content. Buddy was asleep on his feet, twitching as he dreamed of heroic deeds. And Shadow, the watchful soul, lay beside him, leaning his full weight against Elias's side in an act of complete and unconditional trust. The constant, low-grade ache of grief was still there, a part of his landscape now, like the mountains themselves. But it was no longer a crushing weight. It was just a part of him. It coexisted with the warmth of the dogs beside him, with the quiet joy that had taken root in his heart. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn harmonica, an object he hadn't touched in 2 years. It had been Sarah's favorite thing, his clumsy playing of simple folk tunes. He brought it to his lips, the cold metal a familiar ghost. He hesitated for a moment, the fortress walls threatening to rise again. Then he looked down at Shadow, who looked up at him with those deep, knowing eyes. Elias took a breath and played. A simple, quiet melody drifted out into the twilight, a song that was both mournful and hopeful. It was a song for Sarah and for Max, a song of remembrance. But it was also a song for Sheba, Buddy, and Shadow. It was a song for new beginnings. It was the sound of a soldier who had finally, truly come home.